What did you do?
I said we're going live.
And you angered the Googles.
Yeah, I apologize, Google. It's all my fault. Please don't kill me first in the robot apocalypse. And whenever something weird happens around this house, we say that's a good thing. Let's go to the gallery view here. There we go. What? Oh, I know what the problem is.
I'm just going to be amused.
But does that not happen to you? Do you not have the robots in your house
I
occasionally?
do.
Yeah.
So I've learned when I'm streaming to press the little mute button so they stop accepting input.
What?
Yours doesn't have a little mute button on it? So okay.
But the house is filled with them. How I could never find them all. I've got like 7 of them.
My house isn't as full of yours. So this is Alexa. I press. Okay, now I've angered her.
See? Apologize.
There we go. So
she's turned red.
So
she's releasing the kill drones now.
Right. That's because I muted her, and so she's red and angry when she's muted.
Right. Okay. No, I don't think I can do that. I don't think Google will permit that.
You're kidding. Oh no.
I don't know.
So
maybe I haven't figured it out.
Okay.
Yeah, I much prefer to just let it listen nonstop and judge me, and then add that to this gigantic lexicon of what it knows.
I think mine is closer to my mic than yours. So
we have never had a special guest in the show like this before. I think we had Paul Sutter like 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So this could be weird, and I apologize in advance. So we have no idea how this is going to work. So
we're just going to pretend we're at Dragon Con, basically.
Yeah, totally. That's exactly right. This is like we're at Dragon Con, and we've got someone that we're on a panel with, and we're just gonna go from there. And I have no idea. And if this all goes wrong, it's Paul's fault.
and we're all recording to Audacity still. Yes.
I haven't started my Audacity yet, but
I haven't either. I'm still opening
Paul,
it. Paul, do you have Audacity
or some recording device? He does.
I do, yeah.
Yeah, you start your recording.
Okay.
I can say hi to a bunch of people.
I have Audition. I can record in that.
Whatever you want. Whatever you can generate a wave file.
You don't need to press start yet, but be ready.
Be ready to record. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to say hi to a bunch of people. Hi to Catalin Bontia, Colin Jones, Dusty Reichwin, Gordon Dewis, Graham Walbridge, Guido Bibra, Harry M., Henrik Bo Anderson, Janelle Duncan, John Seffield, Joseph Myers, Magnus Thymer Jensen, Nancy Graziano, Peter Quinn, Rabbit Holer, Thomas Traneker, and Zappan Zappan. Hey, everybody. I like when we record at weird times, and because
we get totally different people.
Because we get different people who, I'm sure, like working, and they're not able to hang out with us.
Yeah.
At the normal time that we record, and so whenever we do this, they don't see this as a downside. They actually see this as a unique opportunity to come and be able to do the live show, which I think is great.
And pardon me while I adjust lights and hair, folks. Saturday is my day when normally I spend the morning completely cleaning my house. Then I put my hair in a ponytail, paint all afternoon, get covered in paint.
Yep.
And I'm not required to look clean until 5 in the afternoon. And I adore all of you. And so
that's the sacrifice.
Yeah. So I didn't get my lights and stuff ready because I had goofed time zones must get ready for Astronomy Cast moment.
No, weird time of recording is weird, but that's what happens when we travel. All right, I think we're ready. You ready? Everybody ready? Paul, you ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
Are we pressing record?
I'm ready to press record. Let me just shift this over. Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what's gonna happen. All right. Anyway, I'll figure it out.
The robot apocalypse will occur?
I'll figure this out. I'll figure this out. We'll do this live. All right, here we go.
Okay, here we go.
Everyone press record.
I am recording. Hello, Chad.
Hello, Chad. Okay. Get my intro. Here we go. Astronomy Cast, episode 478. Apollo 8. Welcome to Astronomy Cast, our weekly facts-based journey through the cosmos, where we help you understand not only what we know, but how we know what we know. I'm Fraser, Cain, publisher of Universe Today. With me is Dr. Pamela, the Director of Technology and Citizen Science at the Astronomical Society of the Pacific, and the Director of CosmoQuest. Hey, Pamela, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Fraser?
Good, but we also have a special guest in an unusual first-time discussion with Paul Hildebrandt to talk about his new documentary about Apollo 8. Paul, welcome to Astronomy Cast.
Thanks, Fraser. Happy to be here.
There you go. All right. So, as I mentioned, we have not had a regular guest like this, so I'm going to apologize in advance that we don't really know how the balance is going to be, how this is going to work. So, but let us know. Give us some feedback if you want to have extra guests here in Astronomy Cast from time to time, and we'll see how this all works out. So, Paul, you are a guinea pig. Welcome to our experiment. On Christmas Day, 1968, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders became the first human beings to see the far side of the moon. Their mission, of course, was Apollo 8, the first time humans had ever left Earth orbit and gone around the moon. Today we talk about Apollo 8 with special guest Paul Hildebrandt, director of a new documentary about the mission. Paul, how's it going? I'm
good. How are you guys doing today?
So far, so good. All right, so set the scene then for us. Let's talk about Apollo 8. What, for those who perhaps aren't super up on their space lore, what was Apollo 8?
Sure. So I'll give the brief description. Apollo 8 was the first time that humans ever left Earth.
Well, they'd left Earth before.
Yeah.
So comedic timing here. Been listening to Alan Alda all morning on the radio. So we'd left Earth plenty before then, but we actually left the gravitational primary sphere of influence of the Earth. So it wasn't just leaving the planet. It was falling into a different gravity well, which is kind of awesome. Everyone wants to fall into a well occasionally.
Well, but Paul, how did Apollo 8 sort of fit within the kind of the mission plan of the Apollo, of all the Apollo missions?
Yeah, so Apollo as a program, they had different goals along the way. They'd have to test the command module, test the Saturn 1B, the Saturn 5, test the lunar module. And Apollo 8 was originally going to happen much later, but NASA and the CIA received intelligence that the Soviets were going to try to orbit a man around the moon. And they said, well, wait a minute, we got to do this now. So they basically just scrapped the lunar module that was supposed to go on Apollo 8. And they said, hey, Frank, what do you think about going around the moon instead of just going into orbit? Because Apollo 8 was originally just going to be an Earth orbital mission. And they changed all that and decided to go around the moon instead. So it was a big leap from what they originally planned.
Now, one of the things that was very different about the Apollo missions compared to, for instance, what Elon Musk is doing right now, is with Musk, each of the new Falcon 9s, each of the new Falcon Heavies, presumably, is going to be an evolution on the prior one, where they're constantly updating their technology. They're constantly figuring out how to do things better. But with the Apollo rockets, this was like, we've got this, we're testing it. It wasn't this constant evolution. So was there any reason not to commit and go?
Well, I mean, they had to make some changes after the Apollo 1 fire. They had discovered that the command module was kind of shoddily put together by North American Aviation. And the 100% oxygen atmosphere was unsafe. So they had to make some changes to the command module itself. And respectively, I think probably the lunar module, I'm not an expert on that, but they probably had to make some upgrades there as well. But they really they had the plans, they had the plans laid out as to what they were going to do.
So they have plans, they're working towards it. And it was realized, holy expletive, this stuff is working. Were there any external reasons other than, well, we're used to doing things slow and methodically here? Were there any reasons to push it forward or not push it forward?
In my interviews with the crew, I mean, there weren't really any hidden reasons why they said that they did it slowly. It was just the way that NASA worked. They would just do it one step at a time because that was what was perceived as safe.
But it's interesting, right, that they had that intelligence, and actually the Russians, the Soviets, never actually got around to sending a human around the moon, right? I mean,
That's right.
they were building the N1 rocket, but they never got a chance to actually get that thing in any, it just failed on the launch pad.
Right. Yeah, actually on YouTube, if you go on there, I think there's some really bad video of the glorious explosions that occurred every time they tried to launch the N1.
Yeah.
It was just,
well, and of course, shades of today where, you've got the N1 was the most rocket engines that had ever been assembled on any rocket at any one time, and it turned out to be a disaster. And now it's going to be eclipsed by the Falcon Heavy, which is the most rocket engines ever assembled on one rocket ever. And so, let's all hope that we don't get shades of the N1. All right, so you've got the Apollo 8 mission crew. So did they have like what were the science goals apart from don't die?
That's always a goal.
Well, of course, yeah, that's the background goal that's always going on, right? Don't die when you make this trip around the moon. But what was the, what
were they hoping to learn?
Yeah, what were they hoping
mission?
to learn from this mission?
Yeah, I mean, it was very important that they basically needed to prove that they could get to the moon. Because nobody had ever done it before. And, what was going to happen when you left the Earth's gravity? They couldn't just fall back to Earth at that point. They were on their way to, basically another planet, another body. And so it was their job to be the pathfinders, to go and photograph the lunar surface, to look closely at the landing sites that they had planned for Apollo 11 and beyond. They orbited the moon. They named mountains, craters. They brought back all kinds of photographs to NASA so that they could further plan the missions that would come.
And what was the actual flight plan, the flight path that they took?
Yeah. I think I have a photograph of it. I can find it, but
well, remember, we got podcast listeners. So.
Yeah, right. So just describe.
So they, you launch from the Earth and you basically shoot out to the moon, and they would essentially figure eight around the moon and come back. But they orbited several times. I can't remember how many times they orbited, but they did orbit several times, and then they came back. And it's kind of funny because if you look at the Apollo 8 mission patch and the number 8 itself, it's basically their flight plan. You figure 8 around the Earth, you go out to the moon, come back in the same way, and that really was what their flight plan was. And so a lot of similarities there. And of course, on one of their last orbits is when they took the now famous Earthrise photo, which was the first time that we'd ever seen Earth like that. Never seen Earth from that distance, from that perspective. Here's the moon, and then there's the Earth.
And it's more than that. They were the first people to ever get so far from the Earth that they could see the entirety of the Earth, horizon to horizon, with black on all sides. Prior to that, in lower Earth orbit, there'd always been some direction that you have to crane your neck. It's no one look straight and you see the whole Earth surrounded by space, because you were just too up close to the Earth. And so they literally, for the first time ever, saw Earth isolated And this was really where the concept of the overview effect finally started to
Right.
become a thing.
Which sort of feeds into what we talked about just a couple of episodes ago.
Yeah. During Bill Andrews' interview that I did with him, it was interesting because to us here on Earth, the Earthrise photo is the photo that became the most famous. But he had mentioned that to him, the moment that really affected him the most was when they were flying out to the moon. And now, when Apollo 8 was flying out to the moon, they weren't going head first. The spacecraft was actually backwards. So the command module was facing towards the Earth, because when they launch, they spin around to simulate the docking with the lunar module and then thrust back towards the moon. And so they could actually see the Earth getting smaller and smaller and smaller in the window. And then it wasn't until much later, when they were orbiting the moon, that they saw the lunar surface appear. So it was his view of the Earth getting smaller against this what he described it as, this black velvet of space, that really affected him. And he started to think, man, you know, everybody I've ever known or will ever known or have ever known is right there. And Jim Lovell famously describes it as, you know, everybody can be behind my thumb as I hold it up.
Well, one of the things that I find so fascinating when you first kind of learn about that Earthrise picture is that you can only see that event when you're orbiting the moon, because the moon is tidally locked to the Earth. And so when later on, when the Apollo astronauts were standing on the surface of the moon, the Earth would appear in the sky to them permanently. Right. Mm-hmm. And so it's only when you have that orbital perspective that you can actually see that moon rise up or to see the Earth rise up and be able to do that. And again, that idea that you can just cover the entire Earth with one thumb, that you can obscure all humanity with that one thumb. So who played which roles on the Apollo 8 mission? What were their jobs?
Yeah. So first is Frank Borman, who was the commander. And Frank had previously been on Gemini with Jim Lovell, Gemini 7, I think, but don't quote me on that.
You just quoted you on that.
Yeah. The next was Bill Anders. Bill was originally supposed to be the lunar module pilot, but of course they didn't have a lunar module, which he was disappointed about. So he was essentially given the job as flight engineer and photographer.
And we are so grateful for his photos. These are absolutely amazing. Various people have been working to restore them. You can get them and print them if you reach out to the right people at NASA. No, I don't know who the right people are. I have seen museum quality displays of these photos, and it's one of these things that reminds you that film has higher resolution than any of our digital detectors. They're amazing.
Mm-hmm. Of course, and they did use state-of-the-art Hasselblad cameras on these Apollo missions that were designed specifically for this. So, you know, it wasn't your average off-the-shelf camera that they were taking to the moon.
Yeah, really nice cameras. Right. So, and Jim Lovell ended up being obviously one of the most experienced astronauts in the entire NASA program. He was on many of the missions. Tell me a bit more about the crew.
Yeah, so Jim Lovell, last member of the crew, he was the command module pilot. So he was basically navigator, and he ran the computer and really was in charge of where the ship was going. Frank did a lot of the steering, and he was on the controls quite a bit as commander. But Jim ran the Apollo guidance computer, and there's a funny story about that as they come back as well. But
so tell us the story. You can't just leave us hanging like that.
So on the way back, the crew describes Jim as just, you know, he's just punching numbers into the computer like crazy. He's really confident. You know, he's click 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 click. He's putting all the numbers in, and then he accidentally hits the command, basically the reset button. And the spacecraft then thinks it's back on the launch pad. So the spacecraft reorientates itself as it would be if it was on the launch pad. and Frank Borman is sleeping at the time. So all of a sudden, the spacecraft, starts jerking around because it doesn't know what's going on, and he wakes up, and there's basically this huge struggle to put the numbers back into the computer and reprogram it so they can get back to Earth. So that's one of the dramatic moments of the mission. But luckily they figured it out and got back. Not nearly as dramatic as Apollo 13, but
this gives you a sense of how much technology has changed since then. They were essentially using an analog system that the reset button took it back, I believe, to the beginning of the magnetic tape. And they had this set of commands that was in there that went in order. And if you reset it, and then you had to find where you were supposed to be. They also partially navigated by looking at the stars. They were carrying all sorts of hand navigation devices like you would have expected to see if you're watching black sails navigate pirates. They used stuff like that to navigate the Apollo, because this was in a day before we had computers that could do things. And instead they had folks down in Houston doing, okay, burn on my mark, and they're pressing the buttons. So someone sneezes at the wrong moment and your engine thrust is starting a second late.
Yeah, I mean, they were, Bill Anders thought they had one chance in three of returning to the Earth. They weren't quite sure that they were going to make it, and they were all very afraid that the service module main engine wasn't going to light. And if it didn't, they'd still be orbiting the moon today. Because when you're around the Earth, it's easy enough to get back down, but when you're orbiting the moon, you're kind of stuck there unless you can produce enough thrust to get back.
Well, and there's also all of the orbital mechanics involved in this. So you have your situation where you have the Earth, you have the moon, and when they first launch, if you don't fire your engines once you get to low Earth orbit, you're just going to have a ballistic trajectory. You have to fire once you're up there to put yourself into an actual orbit going around the planet. Then you have to fire again to get yourself out of that orbit around the Earth and into that figure eight that puts you in front of the moon as the moon's orbiting around the Earth, so that the moon's gravitational well can then grab you. But that's not enough. You have to additionally fire your engines to get yourself going circularly around the moon. And then once you're in that circular movement around the moon, you now need to fire your engines again so that you're headed out to be in front of the Earth. This is why it's the figure eight. It's so that you can constantly be putting yourself in front of the thing you're hoping to get to, because in front is a better place to be than behind. And when you put yourself in front, you then have to fire your engines again to get yourself either into orbit or to ballistically come down where you mean to come down. And so there's all of these different engine firings that have to be timed precisely, or you don't end up in the right orbit. And instead of being in orbit, you're a missile.
One of the things that I think is also very interesting and kind of unnerving is Borman got sick on the mission. Did they talk at all about that, Paul?
They did, yeah. So it's the story is, that morning they wake up and they have their breakfast of steak and eggs, and on the way out, and this has been described before in previous interviews more graphically than they told it to me, but he basically it was coming out
both ends
of both ends.
Yeah.
And he got quite sick, and they couldn't figure out why, but they didn't tell NASA.
Yeah,
because they knew that NASA was going to say, you guys need to come back. And what they described to me was, coming from a military career and being test pilots, it was almost worse to fail than to die. And they would rather die than fail.
Wow.
So
and this was back in the peak of failure is not an option, is the NASA slogan. And thankfully, with Curiosity, that started to become more of a dare mighty things. But when failure is not an option, is what you're told, it's do or die. There is no
But
try.
they were all soldiers, right? They were
Yeah.
all military test pilots. The whole Apollo program, all of them back then, were all Top Gun aces, right? And their
Mhm.
job was to fly these. But and so they all came from this military background, and I think that's exactly right. That what Paul is saying is that for them, you are more concerned about the mission. You're more concerned about your your wingmen in this case who were in the capsule with you, and that was the way their brains worked. And so it's interesting that they didn't tell NASA that they were literally in the middle of a shower of Frank Borman's vomit for the mission, and they tried to
Yeah.
clean it up as best they could, but it was all pervasive. I mean, what a ordeal to go through. But I mean, for them, in the end, it didn't kill them, so they made it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Frank later attributed it to a sleeping pill that he took because I guess
Oh,
he had trouble
jeez.
sleeping in space, and he had never gotten space sick before. He had been up for 2 weeks on Gemini 7 with Jim Lovell, never gotten space sick. But of course, there's a lot more room to move around in Apollo than there was in Gemini. There's no room to move in Gemini. Um, and so they were doing somersaults in a spacecraft that they couldn't do in Gemini, and so he got sick, and they gave NASA a notification of it through a sort of covert means. There was a separate taping system on Apollo that sent back a different feed, a non-public feed, back to the ground, and they sort of hinted at the fact that Frank was sick on this tape, um, after it had happened, and by that point he was fine, and they told him to continue on because they didn't want to make it public. They didn't want to worry their families or anybody else back on Earth that Frank Borman was throwing up in the capsule on the way to the moon.
Yeah. What were some of the other like really kind of tricky parts of the mission that had to go exactly right, or everybody was going to die?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, the burn back around the moon was what they were most concerned with, and the re-entry itself was a pretty powerful
And I
moment.
guess both of those had never been tried before. No one had ever tried to do a I guess an entry burn to go into orbit around the moon, and nobody had ever tried to do a re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere coming from a translunar orbit, right?
Right, right. I mean, they were going at the time. This was the speed record. I don't remember how fast they were going, but it was really fast, and they were just coming straight in from the moon to the Earth, and down they went, and everything luckily worked out okay. I mean, it is really amazing, and it's really a testament to the technical skill of everybody involved in the Apollo program that things went as well as they did. When you look at, you know, basically we had two accidents, Apollo 1 and Apollo 13, and even Apollo 13, that they were able to fix that and bring them back is just amazing.
Panic
So
moment for
it's
me. Go ahead, Bella.
so so uh this is one of those situations where they literally couldn't test whether or not the parachutes were going to work as needed because they didn't know if they'd be able to dump enough velocity off coming through the atmosphere. And this is the same problem that we have often trying to figure out if parachutes will work on Mars. We just don't have the actual circumstances. With a lot of spacecraft, you can figure out as they're coming through, they're going to hit terminal velocity. You can figure out what the G forces are going to be ahead of time, and you know what the stresses on the body are going to be. With this spacecraft, they could calculate the G forces, but we were still coming to understand our upper atmosphere. And so they weren't 100% sure what velocity they'd be at on the other side of the atmosphere. I think, please correct me, you know a lot more about this than I do. And so there's and we shall over engineer these parachutes. What were the stresses on the body that these folks that had to go from the fastest ever to not as fast, what were the stresses they went through?
Yeah, well, Bill Anders, I basically I know what they described to me, and what he said was that and all of them said this. So I'll start with the launch. The launch of the rocket, they said it was an old man's booster. The Saturn V was an old man's booster because it really wasn't that bad, but it did shake so violently that at points they thought that it was just going to fly apart on the way up. This was the first time that anybody had ever rode the Saturn V. All the previous Apollo test missions with people on them happened on the Saturn 1B, which is kind of like a half-size version of the Saturn V.
Still a monster, but yeah.
Yeah.
And by old man's rocket, what you mean is it accelerated at a lower rate.
Right.
So
gentle.
The number of multiples of the force of gravity that folks felt was much less. But it's that launching of a 747, you need further runway to get up to the speed you need to get, and wow, that entire thing shakes while you're trying to take off.
It's interesting, right? You learned some of the astronauts, like these Soyuz, it sounds like that rocket just jumps off the pad. It's quite terrifying because its only job is to carry a couple of human beings up to space, and so it doesn't need that big long 747 runway. Man, that just sounds scary. So Paul, sorry, continue, Paul. You were saying that the launch was okay.
Yeah. The launch was okay. Staging was violent. So what they told me was when the third stage separates, they would instinctively put their hands up because they would get thrown forward into the control panel, and their harnesses would hold them back, but they would put their hands up because they thought they were going to hit the control panel, because when it stages, it throws them forward and then throws them back. And Bill Anders actually hit his watch on his helmet, and there's an indent on his helmet now to where his watch on his that he was wearing on his wrist hits his helmet. And now the other two guys were more used to this, but this was Bill Anders' first space flight. Borman and Lovell had been up on Gemini, and Lovell had been up twice, the second time with Buzz Aldrin. So they were more used to the launch experience and the staging experience, but Anders was not. And this happens, this third stage, second stage, and then they're off to the moon. And on the way back down, it becomes extremely hot, and they can see fire outside of the windows, and probably the best part, what's funny about these guys is they don't describe the re-entry or the launch as dramatically as you would think. For us, such an event is so amazing and so dramatic, but to these guys, it's just another day. It's just another day at the office.
And one of the safer test aircraft test vehicles they've ever flown.
And to clarify, it wasn't fire as in chemical burning exothermic process that they were seeing. What they were seeing was the frictional heating as the kinetic energy of their spacecraft, that motion energy of their spacecraft got dumped into the atmosphere around their spacecraft, and the air heated up so much that it gave off light.
Wow. Mm-hmm. So we're sort of nearing the end of our time. Paul, let's talk a bit about the documentary here. So, your documentary on Apollo 8, you had a chance to actually interview all three of the astronauts, and you recorded a pile of footage. How much time did you spend talking with them?
Yeah, so I spent 2 days with Frank Borman, and 1 day with Jim Lovell, and 1 day with Bill Anders. Frank, basically, we split his interview into 2 days, sort of a half day each day. So gave him, came back and reflected a little bit more. So we have a lot of footage. We have basically, I asked them everything from when they were born to, their entire military career, what they felt was necessary about serving their country, and why they joined NASA, why they wanted to join NASA. So we're going to really present their entire biography. And it's really an amazing story. From Frank Borman telling how he went to Berlin when it was separated, and he saw just the harsh conditions that the Soviet Union had put on that country. Really motivated him to win the Cold War. And these guys, in their own words, these guys were cold warriors of their own, and their war was in space, and it was their job to win that war. After that, we're talking about their NASA career through Gemini, and then the mission itself, a full accounting of the mission from launch to landing, and the effects of the mission afterwards. Apollo 8 was not just the first mission to the moon, and it was not just another flight in the Apollo program. The effect of the Earthrise photo and the effect of all of the pictures that came back from the Apollo program, where we could see the Earth had, if you look at the evidence, massive effect on environmental legislation in the following years. The Environmental Protection Agency was created in 1970. The various versions of the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, DDT was banned. So a lot of things happened after Apollo 8, because we now had this, this cosmic perspective, right? The perspective of seeing the Earth from a distance that we had never seen before. And I think it made people think a lot differently about that.
So now, as you mentioned, you are gathering this footage together. You are going to be making a documentary about it, and you've got a Kickstarter right now to help you get the movie made. When does the Kickstarter end?
Yeah, so we have a Kickstarter. We're trying to raise $100,000 for the post-production of the film. So this is music, animation, archival film, and the Kickstarter ends on February 15th.
Excellent. And so where can people go to participate?
So they can go to our website, which is firstmoonmovie.com, or they can go to Kickstarter and search for First to the Moon, and we'll come up there.
Fantastic. Well, Paul, thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of Astronomy Cast, talking about Apollo 8, and good luck with making the movie. I mean, I can't wait to see the interviews that you've done with these guys. I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Fraser. Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.
All right.
And now we save.
So we stop and we save.
And this is 77?
78.
Oh, dang. Okay. And I'm slowly freezing, so I'm going to hit the on button on that space heater.
Go crazy. Let me just save this. All right, and then let's get some questions from people. If anyone has some questions for Paul. Actually, people want to know, Paul, what's your favorite Star Trek? I think they know the answer to that question.
That one right there. The Next Generation.
Yeah. People, you've got an Enterprise on the filing cabinet behind you there.
I do. That was my generation Star Trek, So it's partly what inspired me to get interested in space.
Gordon wants to know what. I'll shift this to the gallery view here. Let's see here. Hold on. Okay, there we go. Gordon wants to know what tomorrow's episode of Astronomy Cast is going to be all about.
So on CosmoQuest, we're going to be working on getting a CCD to work on Twitch, but we are not recording another
That one
episode
there
of Astronomy Cast.
CCD to work?
Yes.
Yeah, good luck.
Yes.
Yeah, you let me know how it goes. I haven't been able to get mine to work, but then I have nothing but rain and clouds. I've warned
This
OPT.
is because we got new telescopes.
I know, and they were like, "Oh, we want to send you a
cursed
telescope."
the universe.
Yeah, and I was like, "Don't." Like, there's no point. There's no value for me having a telescope until the summertime, because it just rains and it rains and it rains and it rains. We've had
Big
months...
J.
Oh, go ahead.
Big J and I, Big J's in the chat. It chats down there, I guess. Big J and I are going to be on twitch.tv/CosmoQuestX fighting with George and Gracie, which are our two telescopes. Let's see if anyone can catch the two different references that those names have. And we're going to be working on getting a CCD working and hopefully getting first light. So this is our goal. Tomorrow, 11 a.m. Central, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. London.
Let's see. Are there any more questions? Come on, hit us some questions. You must have some Apollo 8 questions. Otherwise, we'll wrap this up.
It's an ATEC CCD, Astronomy 716. I don't remember the number, but it's an ATEC. I think it's an ATEC 1 is the type, and then 6 is the version number.
Gordon said he had to apologize to astronomers in Northeast and North America because they kept buying new telescope parts. Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so we have one of the George and Gracie's got nailed. Can we get the third George and Gracie or the second George and Gracie reference? I think Peter has it.
Ben Kayla wants to know, how did Apollo 8 handle telemetry for position in orbit, when to burn, etc.? What was the 1960s version of GPS? Paul? How did they know when to do their burn?
As far as I know, that was all pre-calculated by NASA. I mean, they had a flight plan, and they were told what to do and when to do it.
So like someone at Mission Control said, prepare yourself, now press the button.
Right. I mean,
do the burn, stop the burn.
Yeah. When you hear Apollo 8, you are go for TLI, and off they went. And they had a flight plan, and they would just look at their watch, and when it came time to start the burn, they would do it. That was all the guys at Mission Control that made that magic happen.
And they did confirm locations as they went. They did make sure that the whole stay on target. The windows for the Apollo missions actually helped them line up what they were doing.
Right. So they were able to communicate, like the folks on the ground were able to communicate with them. They knew where they were. They were using their radio telescopes to make sure that they were where they were supposed to be as they
Optical. So the 107-inch telescope at McDonald Observatory was purchased by NASA and put there so that they could sight the Apollo missions. And what's hilarious is there was a paperwork foul up at one point, and someone with a big old surplus truck showed up at the observatory to surplus the telescope, which had, through various correctly filed stuff and things, been gifted or granted, or I don't know the correct word, to the University of Texas for McDonald Observatory for continued science use. Like up through, I was using it on my dissertation. It's still out there doing awesome things. So this telescope was built in part to enable the Apollo missions.
That is awesome. Some people in the chat are mentioning that you actually can't use GPS to go to the moon even today. But one thing that's pretty neat is that NASA recently has demonstrated that pulsar navigation works and will work well. And so you can imagine a standard future navigation system that relies on pulsars to be able to know where you are, not only within the solar system, but also within the nearby region of the Milky Way, which is just amazing. And so and I guess you're just detecting the Doppler shift changes as you're moving in different directions within the solar system, which I just love. Tom Harden is wondering, did they ever have an issue with delay in audio, or did they compensate? Right. So there is a delay to get to the moon, right? But it's not long.
It's a second and a half.
Yeah. So all of their commands would have been delayed a second and a half.
And these are things that they did build into what they were doing. Yeah. And what's kind of awesome is this is the same kind of delays that we've all gotten used to when we're watching telecasts that are using geosynchronous satellites to bounce the signals around the planet. It's the same order of delay that breaks your brain and kind of hurts, but is completely manageable.
Of course, they did lose connection when they go to the dark side of the moon. But as Frank in his interview mentioned, to the second they regained contact, and to the second they lost contact. So, the math doesn't lie.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think it was time to wrap things up. Just one reminder, as always, if you are watching this show live and you want to be a participant in the community that surrounds and boosts the show, go to wshcrew.space. And there's also they provide the chat that's going on down below in our Slack community, but also there's the Google Plus community where they're sharing lots of great stories and stuff. So give that a shot. Once again, Paul, where do people go to participate in the Kickstarter and see the movie as it moves through development?
Yeah, firstmoonmovie.com.
Right on.
And I need to do one last shameless plug.
Yeah.
If you're watching this live in roughly 40 minutes, I will be going live on twitch.tv/Starstrider, and I'm going to be painting worlds.
There.
Okay, I'm going to be painting worlds like this, and you will be able to purchase anything you fall in love with on Etsy in a couple of days once it's completely dry. So catch me on Twitch in about 40 minutes.
Okay, let's shift to the gallery view, and we'll all say goodbye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stop the stream. Come on, mouse.